Well, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Sydney Howard, Growth Manager at D&A Communications, and I'm excited to be joined by Amira Barger, Executive Vice President, and Trish Abbott, our Vice President of Account Services. While we're waiting for a few more folks to trickle in, drop in the chat where you're joining from today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. We are recording today's session, so if you join late or want to revisit anything, we'll make sure the recording is in your inbox after we wrap. And please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or in the Q&A feature throughout. I'll be collecting them and we'll get to as many as we can during our Q&A. We are especially excited because today's session marks the launch of a new quarterly webinar series from D&A called In Between Us. Our goal is to create a space where communicators, community engagement professionals, public sector leaders, and changemakers can come together to explore emerging trends, practical tools, and proven strategies for building trust and creating meaningful impact. We hope you'll join us not only today, but for future conversations throughout the year. As an equity first communications firm, D&A believes that how we communicate is just as important as what we communicate. The stories we tell, the language we choose, and the perspectives we center all shape how people engage with our work. Today, we'll introduce the asset framing model and explore how it can help organizations communicate in ways that build trust, foster connection, and create lasting community impact. Our goal is to provide practical tools and insights that you can apply to your own communications, engagement, and stakeholder strategies. So, Amira and Trish, let's begin.
Wonderful. Thanks so much,
Wonderful.
Sydney. Appreciate you as our MC. Welcome, everyone. Glad to be here with you, and thanks for engaging with us in the chat as well. Feel free to do that throughout. And to set the stage for today's session, there are three things that we're going to focus on. First, we are going to explore the principles behind equity first communications, and specifically why language and framing matter so much. Second, we are going to look at how communication choices shape trust and perception. And finally, we are going to share some practical tools, and we're actually going to do some practicing together with these tools so that you can leave the room today and right away work on creating more effective and audience-centered communications. And by the end of our time together, our hope is that you'll leave with those practical ideas that will give you a stronger understanding of how communications can really serve as this bridge between organizations and the communities that you or they are seeking to reach, to serve, or to build trust with across communities. So, what in the world is asset framing? We are so glad that you asked, and we're going to talk about it. Asset framing is something that was developed and coined, the phrase itself, by a social entrepreneur and author, and his name is Trabian Shorters. And if you work in or adjacent to the nonprofit sector, you probably know, have heard from, or seen Trabian on a stage talking about asset framing over the last 10 years. And Travian's work has really helped organizations rethink the way that they communicate about people and about communities very specifically. And at its core, the concept is really simple. The way that we tell a story shapes how people understand it. That's sort of the baseline of what it is. So instead of leading with someone's challenge or barriers, we lead with their strengths, with their aspirations, and with the contributions that they can make or want to make to the world. So here's a quick example. Rather than saying a homeless person, which is a phrase you've probably heard a lot, we might say a neighbor working to secure stable housing. You see the difference there? So the challenge is still there, right? This person doesn't have a place to lay their head at night. They don't have housing. And we're not ignoring the challenge that they're facing, but it's not the central element of the story, and it no longer becomes that person's identity, right? So again, a homeless person versus a neighbor working to secure stable housing. There's a lot more dignity in the way you say that second phrase. And that's really the heart of what asset framing seeks to do. So we start with who people are and what they're working towards, and then we provide context around the challenges or barriers that they might be facing. And why does all of that matter? because language shapes our perceptions. So think about it this way. If your doctor tells you that a procedure you absolutely have to have has a 10% chance of death, instead of saying, "Hey, Amira, this procedure that you desperately need has a 90% chance of survival," right? The facts are identical. It still adds up to 100%, but your reaction is probably going to be very different hearing 10% death rate, 90% survival rate. So the way the information is framed really influences how you interpret it and then the actions that you will or maybe won't take based on that communication. And asset framing applies that exact same kind of principle or set of principles to the way that we communicate about people and communities. So when we lead with strengths instead of deficits, our communication becomes so much more human centered, it's more respectful, and ultimately it is more effective in moving people towards action. And that is why we communicate, right? The art of communicating is we're exchanging messages, and often we want people to do something. That something could be to volunteer, to buy a product, to advocate, to seek more information, or what have you, to ride the San Francisco ferry or fly out of SFO, you name it. And at D&A, asset framing and some of these principles are just one of the many tools in our toolbox for how we practice equity first in our work and that philosophy that we hold dear. And whether we're communicating about healthcare, about education, transportation, community engagement, it really helps us tell a more complete story about people and communities that we have the privilege of helping to serve and to reach. So, before we dive into practicing with some of the framework, we wanted to take a look at a few examples of how really simple shifts in language, just a word or two here or there, and framing can dramatically change how a message is received. So I'm going to kick it over to Trish to walk us through some examples.
Thank you, Amira. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. One of the simplest ways to communicate more effectively is to be more precise. Precision really demonstrates respect, it improves clarity, and leads to better communication. So, most of us use phrases without ever thinking about where they come from. Things like slaving over a hot stove, or someone being low on the totem pole, or even getting gypped on a deal. Most of the time, nobody's saying these mean any harm, but they're just baked into how we talk, right? But every one of them has real roots in somebody's lived history. And once you know that, it's really hard to unhear. So the fix isn't really complicated. It's swapping for something just as vivid that doesn't carry the weight. And it's a small habit, but it's the kind of small habit that tells people you're actually paying attention. So choosing more thoughtful alternatives isn't about perfection. It's about communicating with intention. So here's an example. We don't have any minorities involved in this initiative. Instead, try, we need to consider how we can invite and include more Black and Native American staff. So again, subtle framing, but big impact. Next slide, Sid. So language shapes perception. You're going to hear this throughout the whole series. Some commonly used phrases draw on disability-related terms in ways that can unintentionally reinforce stigma or exclusion. By selecting more thoughtful and, again, precise alternatives, we can communicate more effectively while fostering greater respect, inclusion for all audiences. So this part can trip people up because these words feel very normal. That's crippling, or I have a blind spot there. That comment was so tone deaf. And I'll be honest, some of these were in my own vocabulary before I really started paying attention. And a lot of them borrow from disability to describe something negative. And that's the part worth catching. So you don't lose any punch by saying, that's intense instead of crippling, or insensitive instead of tone deaf. Same meaning, less baggage. So, effective communication requires us to be mindful of how language shapes people's experiences. And so, similar to the disability rooted language, gendered language can unintentionally reinforce stereotypes, assumptions, or binary understandings of gender, making it important to choose words that are accurate, inclusive, and audience centered. Have you ever noticed how gendered language is just habit? Ladies and gentlemen, you guys, mankind. None of this is intentional. It's just what we grew up hearing, right? But swapping in for everyone, one of my favorite, you all, or humankind, this costs you nothing and it just includes more people in the room. So it's important to note this isn't really about policing language. It's about making sure nobody has to mentally translate themselves out of what you just said. Next slide. So we want to be mindful of using people first and people experiencing language, which can help recognize individuals' humanity and acknowledge that a disability, a circumstance, or an experience within a system does not define the entirety of who they are. And at the same time, language preferences vary across individuals and communities. So it's important, whenever possible, honor the terminology people use to describe themselves and seek clarification when it's appropriate. So, as communicators, we should be intentional about using asset-based language, particularly when writing about experiences outside of our own. So, some examples of people first language: wheelchair bound makes it sound like a sentence, whereas wheelchair user is just a fact. And as Amira mentioned before, homeless person turns someone's circumstance into the identity, whereas a person experiencing homelessness says that this is happening to them right now, not who they are forever. So the same logic with the word survivor instead of victim. One implies permanence, the other implies agency. And look, language preferences aren't universal. As said, we have, when we can, ask people how they describe themselves and really follow their lead. So, we're talking about alternatives to language. Asset framing is less about changing words. It's about it, but less, but more about changing perspective. So, why does this matter? How we frame people changes how people see them, and that includes how they see themselves. And that's exactly why it matters in a communications plan, even a creative brief, an engagement strategy. Every framing choice either builds relevance with the people you're trying to reach or quietly pushes them out of the picture. So keep defining someone by their problems, and your brain starts pattern matching that problem to that person, or worse, to everyone who looks like them. That's not an opinion, that's just how stereotyping works. So instead of asking what's wrong here, try asking who are these people and what are they striving for? So challenges still matter in the story, but they aren't the first thing people hear or the only thing they remember. That's the mindset shift that makes asset framing so powerful. We often say that actions earn trust, and they do, but the way organizations communicate also shapes trust. And language influences how people understand issues and perceive organizations and decide whether they feel seen, respected, and included. The words we choose can reinforce assumptions or expand understanding. When we lead with people's strengths and aspirations, we create communications that are authentic, more engaging, and more reflective of the full complexity of the communities we're serving. So, this is really important in the age of AI, and what people are saying online today influences what AI may say tomorrow. So, for those that know, California just announced state agencies, cities, and counties are now going to be equipped with AI tools to draft, summarize, and run day-to-day work. And that means the language already in your reports, communications, website is what AI is pulling from to describe who you serve. So if that language is not precisely framed, that's what gets carried forward. Because AI summarizes existing information, it can repeat or reinforce these narratives. So really to work responsibly, it's monitoring your online conversations, correct any misinformation, understand how they're being described, and build authoritative content. Asset framing is a tool. It challenges us to think more intentionally about how we tell stories and whose strengths, aspirations, and contributions are centered in those stories. Back to you, Amira.
Thanks so much, Trish. So we're getting close to the part where we're going to practice some asset framing together. But first, I wanted to walk through some guiding principles that, again, you're going to get, but these will help us all make more intentional language and framing choices. So on this next slide, you'll see some do's and don'ts, which you're going to get, and feel free to take a screenshot if you want it on your phone quickly. And rather than read through this list, I am going to explain some of these principles and how they come about in practice in the day-to-day. So imagine, for example, you are an organization that helps to mitigate hunger, or maybe you're a communications professional writing about hunger, as an example. So a deficit-based message might read something like, "The hungry need our help." Short, sweet. But asset framing, again, leading with assets and aspirations versus deficits and challenges, asset framing might shift the focus to a sentence that reads something like, "Families are working hard to provide healthy meals, but rising costs of food and limited access to affordable grocery stores makes it really hard and much harder than it should be." Right? So in that second sentence, we're doing two things, right? We start with what families are trying to accomplish, right? Providing healthy meals for their children, for themselves, before we start explaining the barriers that are standing in their way, right? So that very subtle shift keeps the family's goal at the center of the story, but it also gives the reader or the audience really important context about what challenge exists that is keeping families from being able to eat the healthy, nutritious food or access the healthy, nutritious food that they want. And the same is true when we talk about something like housing as another example. So instead of referring to the homeless, we might say people experiencing homelessness, as Trish mentioned. And that's an example of people first, people experiencing language, and reminds us that it is a circumstance that someone is experiencing right here, right now. It's not the whole of who they are or their identity. And you'll also notice that the emphasis on highlighting solutions whenever they exist is a core practice in asset framing. So, as communicators, and we're all communicators, even if that's not your title, we all communicate and write and share and engage. We shouldn't just describe what's broken. We should help people see what's possible. And that's how you build hope, engagement, and momentum in moving people to take action, the action that your organization is working towards, or that you want, or that you need to change something. And on the flip side, there are a few habits that we want to avoid, which you see in the don'ts section of this set of principles. So be careful not to introduce people with labels like at risk, vulnerable, or underprivileged. Those labels on their own can unintentionally become the defining characteristic of someone when you don't give context or further explanation of what it means. And so whenever you describe a disparity, name what's contributing to it, whether that's policy, access, or some sort of systemic, long held historic barrier, rather than just leaving your audience to make some assumptions. So, an example would be if I simply say, "Many people are experiencing hunger." Some people might assume that those individuals just aren't working hard enough or they don't manage their money well. But if I say, "Many working families, because they're working, are experiencing hunger because there are rising food costs, wages are stagnant, and there's limited access to grocery stores that are affordable in their neighborhood and zip code." And that makes it really hard to put food on the table, right? So I started to name some of the source of the problem for people and give them something to hold on to. And the same can be true of, again, another easy example that many of us understand, homelessness, right? If I just say homelessness is increasing, our audience who's reading or hearing this or seeing this might unconsciously assume that people experiencing homelessness, well, they just made poor choices. But if I give context as asset framing asks us to do, I might say, more people are experiencing homelessness because housing costs are rising. There's a shortage in affordable housing. There isn't enough rent control, or there are just too many people in the job market today and not enough jobs. And there are also gaps in mental health and supportive services, right? Giving context so people understand an issue more holistically. And, when we don't name the source of a challenge or a problem or a barrier, again, our audience sort of writes their own in their mind, even if unintentionally or subconsciously. And then I think the final reminder for the do's and don'ts I wanted to mention here, that's always a good one to go back to, is the 2-to-1 rule. So spend as at least twice as much time describing the future that you're working towards, right? Aspirations, as you do describing a problem, a challenge, or a barrier that you're trying to solve. Because asset framing, again, it's not about ignoring challenges or barriers. It's about making sure that hope gets at least as much airtime as that challenge, that barrier, that hardship that the people you're trying to help or that your organization is trying to serve in community might be experiencing and facing. And that's really the heart of asset framing. Not only about words, choosing different words is a core principle and practice, but it's also about the storytelling. The way we tell a story shapes how people experience it and the actions that they will or perhaps won't take. So we want to focus on people's strengths, their aspirations, their potential, and lead with that in the way that we communicate. And on our next slide, this is one of the tools you're going to walk away with. And I think we're going to put this into the chat box. It's a simple checklist. So think of this as your final gut check before you hit send on that email, on that draft for your newsletter or your social media post. And I know for myself as a communicator, whenever I'm writing a message and I stop to review it before it goes to anyone else, I ask myself a few simple questions, and many of them are noted here. And I'll ask, have I named the real source of the problem in the way I've told this story or written this social media post? And if I describe a challenge, an inequity, or a barrier without explaining what's driving it, I pause and ask myself some more questions and ask, are my readers going to fill in the blanks themselves? And, what assumptions might they have? And then finally, I look at whether every descriptor that I've included is actually necessary. And I wanted to give you a few examples of this, and I'll pop them in the chat as well. Because I've always asked, does it help people understand the story? Or is it just labeling someone in a way that doesn't add value? So an example of this would be, instead of saying a low-income resident shared concerns at the community meeting about the transit plan, a better way to write this or say this would be a resident shared concerns about the new transit plan, right? Because income level in that first version only matters if it's central to the issue. And sometimes it is, but it's just a good practice to get into of asking yourself, well, is that descriptor necessary? And does it expand people's level of understanding? Another example would be an elderly woman attended the health fair that we put on. You could just say a community member attended the health fair. Is age actually relevant to the story that I'm telling? And is that descriptor one that's necessary because this is about older adults? So again, asset framing isn't just about all of the perfect words. It's about asking more questions, slowing down, and slowing down long enough to ask, are my communications, whether it's a newsletter, a written speech, a social media post, are they serving to expand people's understanding? Is it building dignity? And does it tell a more complete story about the people and community that we're working with and alongside? So use this as your gut check. And we have a resource again that you'll get emailed out along with these slides. And then I'll kick it back to Trish. And pretty soon here, we're going to start practicing some examples.
We're going to get into school. So building off that, a few terms that get thrown around loosely, like underserved, underrepresented, or low socioeconomic status, none of these are necessarily wrong, but if you're going to use them, back them up. So for example, underserved or under-resourced is used to describe a place, market, or community where fewer goods and services are available than there should be, right? So an underserved community can also refer to disadvantage because of ability to pay, ability to access care, or other disparities for reasons of race, religion, language group, or social status. The use of this terminology should include proof points, if you will. So when framing underserved, we provide context, fewer resources than where, and compared to what. So we want to use these terms when they're accurate and necessary, not as shorthand for this is a tough situation, right? Okay, so let's get into some fun stuff. In the next few slides, as Amira said, Amira will be walking us through a series of before and afters, which will really, I think, hit home to what we're talking about. Each one will be based on education and students. We each have some context for how the education system works in the US, and that shared context will aid us in having a conversation about asset framing. So as we go through these, think about your own work. Swap students for whoever you serve and watch how that same shift applies. Back to you, teacher Amira.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, let's get into these examples. I'm going to read aloud and then we will reveal with our animation the rewrite. So, this sentence is something that might appear on a education-based org's website or in a newsletter. So something like, to learn at their best, Black and Latino children need more opportunities to attend schools that provide equitable access to resources, are free from bias, affirm their identity, and value their life experiences. And we've given you a little bit of a cheat code because we highlighted some of the words that we might change here. So just take a second. If you're comfortable, go to the chat and maybe point out the elements here that might be deficit framed versus asset framed. And is there anything that you would change as a communicator? And then we're going to compare them side by side. All right, let's reveal the rewrite here, Sydney. Okay, I'm going to read it and then tell you what we changed and why. So, all students deserve quality education that affirms their identity, values their life experiences, and invites them to learn with their whole selves. Black and Latino students are less likely to have teachers who look like them or share lived experience and therefore require different resources that are relevant to their identity and experience to achieve equal learning opportunities. And these are real examples. These are changes that were made for an actual organization. And comparing these side by side, first, the rewrite, it leads with aspiration, not the disparity, right? So it starts out compared to the original by affirming that all students deserve a quality education before we even touch any inequities that exist. The second thing the rewrite does is it provides context, right? So rather than stating just simply Black and Latino students need more opportunities, we start to give some light to explaining why those opportunities aren't always equal, right? So we're pointing to representation and access instead of leaving our audience to draw their own conclusions about the challenge here. And then finally, this rewrite tells a more complete story, right? The original focuses on what students lack, right? But the rewrite recognizes, well, students' identities, their experiences, and their strengths are recognized, but it still acknowledges that there are barriers that they're going to face. And this is an example of asset framing in action. So the challenge that our communities or the people we're communicating to are reaching, it doesn't disappear. It just stops being the first and the only thing that people hear about any particular community. So let's do another example. So this one, more than half of US students from low-income backgrounds are below basic proficiency in literacy and math. We give teachers access to resources that help improve instruction and close gaps like this. So take a second, read it again for yourself, and think about what is asset frame, aspirations, contributions, future versus deficit, challenges, barriers, things a community may lack or not have access to. And here comes the reveal. All right. Students in the US, particularly from low socioeconomic communities, experience barriers related to limited resources or access to updated curriculum and pedagogy. This barrier continues to widen the learning gap in literacy and math. Financial status should not be an indicator of learning outcomes, and this is why we give teachers the coaching and resources to end disparity in instruction for all students. So this rewrite is effective because it shifts the focus from student outcomes to the conditions that shape those outcomes. Right? So the original opens with what's wrong. Students are below proficiency. The rewrite begins by acknowledging the barriers that many students are facing, limited resources, limited access to quality curriculum. So it names the source of the problem instead of allowing the reader to assume that maybe perhaps the students themselves are the problem, which is often what will happen if you leave it blank and don't lead your audience to the source of the problem. And this rewrite also broadens the conversation from identifying a gap to describing a solution. We know that there are gaps in education, but what's the solution? What can I do if I'm a person who you're trying to move towards action or trying to reach? How can I help? How can I be a part of the solution and taking some sort of action? So instead of just pointing out the disparities, the rewrite, it ends with a aspiration, right? Every student having access to the instruction and the resources that they need to succeed. So again, asset framing, we're not ignoring inequities. We're not sugarcoating them. We're giving context behind why are the inequities there and focusing on what is the future, what is the opportunity that we're helping to create and being a part of. All right, here comes the next one. We've got two more. So we have four examples in here so that you really have some things to work with when you leave this room today. So this one reads, our mission is to transform the lives of children living in urban poverty through better education, family economic stability, and health. This is hard work, but it's worth it. And go ahead and give us the reveal there, Sydney. And I'll read that one aloud. We are dedicated to improving education, economic stability, and healthcare, so we accelerate human opportunity and positive outcomes for all children and families. So this rewrite shifts the focus from who people are perceived to be and the future that we're trying to create together as their partner. And the original defines the children by where they live and the challenge they face, right? It says children living in urban poverty. And the rewrite starts with a broader aspiration, right? As an organization, we are improving education, economic stability, and health so that these children can thrive. And notice that the mission of the organization here hasn't changed. What's changed is just the way it's framed and said at the outset. So instead of centering the problem, we're centering the opportunity, the possibility that the organization exists to work towards. And that is asset framing. We're inviting people to rally around a vision of what is possible, of action you could take instead of focusing on the challenge alone or defining the people that we get to work with by their circumstance. And another one that comes up a lot, particularly if you work in maybe nonprofit or community engagement organizations, you'll often hear this phrase of this work is hard. Yes, this work is hard, but we might often shift this to something like this is necessary work or we're doing the necessary work. So we are not pretending that the work is easy, but it is about emphasizing the value of the work rather than framing it as a burden, right? So necessary work communicates purpose, responsibility. We're a part of something. But hard work can unintentionally frame it as suggesting that the community we're working with is itself a challenge. But when we describe it primarily as hard work, we center our effort as a person, as an org, versus necessary work, which shifts the focus to why we're doing it in the first place. because children need to thrive, and this is necessary work. So, a small shift, but there are oodles of studies that point to the way our minds perceive these things. So, these shifts are not based in opinion, right? There is science around communication of how we perceive the way things are framed, and something like hard work versus necessary work, particularly in community engagement, public offices, or nonprofit work, can definitely shift how people will engage either with your organization or company or with the very people in community that you're trying to reach and work with. And here's one more example. Working at a Newark, New Jersey high school, Ashley Edwards often overheard students chatting about their everyday problems. She recognized a theme. They weren't naming it this way, but it was trauma, said Edwards, a native of Newark who attended Yale and Stanford. That's just what it's like to grow up in the neighborhoods we live in. And this came from an organization's newsletter. And here is the reveal. At the big city charter school she ran, Ashley Edwards was surrounded by future artists, writers, and engineers who radiated talent and grit. Many of her students were driven to succeed despite encountering racism, poverty, and community violence on a routine basis, she said. She said, she said, I generally describe them as survivors, Edwards said, of the young people at Newark Prep Charter in New Jersey. In communities nationwide, young people growing up in Black families and in households with low incomes regularly endure frightening or threatening situations, the kind of stresses that inflict lasting damage on a child's mental and physical health. So, in the rewrite, instead of opening with the students' problems, the rewrite begins by describing them as future artists, writers, engineers, again, asset framed, opportunity, contribution, aspiration. Only then, after describing them as artists, writers, engineers, it provides context of the barriers that they often navigate based on where they live and their backgrounds. So we don't minimize that racism, poverty, or community violence are very real for these students and their experience. In fact, we name those, but we name those challenges more directly than the original and refuse to let those experiences become the only thing these students are characterized as or known for, right? It is not their identity. So that's one of the most powerful principles of asset framing. People are not the challenges they face, communities are not, organizations are not, right? They are individuals. They have aspirations, they have strengths, they have potential, right? And they happen to be navigating something that is difficult. So a few examples for you to walk away with and to, put in the context of your organization or communications challenges that you may come into contact with every day. And before we wrap up, we just wanted to say thank you for spending time with us today. We know how precious a resource and commodity time is, so we are grateful to you. And we hope that you leave with one simple takeaway that the words that we choose shape the stories that we tell, and those stories really have the power to shape how people are seen and the actions people will or won't take. And asset framing, again, it's not about ignoring challenges and deficits that are very real, but we want to tell more compelling and more complete stories that are about communities and people's strengths, aspirations, their humanity before we discuss those barriers that they face. And as you leave today, we encourage you to ask a question of yourself. Who is centered in the story that you're telling? And what do you want your audience to know, see, think, and do first? So, on behalf of Trish, Sydney, myself, and the entire D&A team, many of whom are here, thank you, friends. Thank you for your engagement, for your partnership, and for the important work that each of you are doing every single day in your company, in your organization, in your homes, and in your communities. And we look forward to continuing the conversation, including now with some Q&A, if you have any for us.
Thank you so much, Trish and Amira. That was incredible. As Amira
Yeah.
mentioned, we do have some time for Q&A, so please feel free to drop your questions into the chat. We'd love to hear them.
Scrolling. Oh, thank you. Thank you all for being here and for the time. And no question is off limits. What are you thinking? Or if you don't have a question, maybe you have an idea, a thought, or a reaction. We'd love to just hear from you. And thank you for the love in the chat. We are seeing it. Had anyone practiced or heard of asset framing in this formal way? I think a lot of you probably do this inherently or intuitively, but how many of you were familiar with asset framing before our conversation today?
Emoji hands.
Yes, I'm seeing them. Nice, nice. There's some great resources and videos which we are going to link. We've got them in the deck. There's an appendix section with different options, whether you like to read, to listen, or to watch. There are resources that we're providing there for you to learn a little bit more. Everything from 60 seconds to an hour. It's up to you how much you want to engage with the resources and tools that will help you plus up your skills in asset framing.
Oh, we did get a question. Melanie asked, noticing asset framing needs context and more space. Many of the rewrites are much longer. How are we navigating this as attention spans are low and space is often limited in different communication formats?
Yeah, such a great question and comes up all the time and has for the last decade over the conversation of asset framing. It does require a bit more space because when you give context, so the format matters, right? When you are giving a speech or a presentation, the words may seem long, but it goes by a little faster. And the other thing you can do is, particularly if you're in written format, is make sure, let's say you're doing some Canva cards for social media. Note to people, there's a link in bio to learn more, right? Here's a quick 1, 2, these 3 slides that provides a high level, but if you want to dig deeper, and there are those people who do, here's where you can do so. So oftentimes pointing to a partner, pointing to your blog post or to another asset that gives those people who want more. That can be helpful and a way to do it. But it is something you need to plan for, right? Your next newsletter might require, 5 more paragraphs. Not five, that's too many, but maybe it's 4. So being really thoughtful about what are we saying and how do we get to the meat of the story? Because attention spans, to your point, Melanie, are very short these days. So less is more in terms of how much of the story we need to tell in one particular asset and where can we point people to other resources, a video, a reel, and your asset should be one of an entire ecosystem, right? We don't have to tell the whole story in the newsletter. There's a reel we can do on social. There is a YouTube video. It is one piece of the larger story. Think of it sort of in a campaign format. And in marketing comms, we say all the time, it takes 6 to stick. People aren't going to get the message the one time in the one social post, the one newsletter, the one blog post they read anyhow. You've got to kind of hammer it home at least 6 times for people to really get the message of, hey, please ride the ferry, or whatever the action is you're trying to drive people towards. So it takes 6 to stick. Think of your comms as an ecosystem where you can tell iterations of the story in different formats and different lengths over the entire ecosystem.
Great. Sandra asks, do you have advice for introducing this approach to someone who isn't familiar with it or might feel like they made some of these mistakes in the past?
Mm.
Yes. Some of the resources we're going to send you. I know for me, and everyone learns differently, I'm a very visual and audible learner. I love some of the reels and the videos that are available. Like I said, there's one that's 60 seconds where even Trabian has done a really great example. There's one where he's doing a conference and he asked the audience one simple question. I think he asked something like, "Who here wants to be known by all of their, negative moments," or something like that, where he just did a really quick 60-second example of painting a picture for people of why asset framing matters. So it was short, it was sweet, it was an example that everyone could understand, which is also why we led with education in our examples here, because Most people have been to school in the US and there's context we all share. So we didn't use some industry or focus that you wouldn't be familiar with. So I think it depends on your audience, but something like a really quick 60-second example of here are a couple of changes someone made that really powerfully changed how someone received that communication or was influenced to take an action. That can be really helpful.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Thanks for the question, Sandra and Mel.
Okay, we got one says, thoughts how
Ooh,
to encourage use dignifying language in interpersonal communication.
yeah. The people to people stuff. I think one of the reasons people struggle the most, and study upon study will back this up, is literally what word do I use? Sometimes the reason people won't practice a different kind of language, more human-centered, more dignified, is they don't know what to say, which is part of why we started with the embrace replace slides of instead of this, try this, because people literally need you to tell them what to say. If I can't say if crazy is insensitive, right? What do I say? Wild. People need the exact example. So I think model the behavior is a good place to start. We try to model this all of the time in how we interact with each other, and in the work that we do. So that's a good place to start. And don't get frustrated when people say, well, I don't know what to say. Say, okay, I just went to this, session with D&A, and here are a few slides with exact words you can swap out. Practice and start from there and then build upon it.
That was great.
Practice, practice, practice.
Absolutely.
And I will also just say, like when someone says something, and especially if you're in a professional context, you want to be careful about correction. And someone says, okay, so I say, oh yeah, wild. I'll just parrot what they just said. And then, some people will catch it and be like, oh, okay, next time I'll say wild. And you can also do private correction of, hey, you said blind spot the other day. Have you thought about saying XYZ instead? Knowledge gap, area of opportunity. And, again, model it for people. So be a good steward of it yourself. And where you can, either privately correct or in a group, provide something like the resources we're going to give you and tell people, hey, I want to talk about this. I just went to this session and I think we could all, use some upskilling in this area. Thanks for
Any other questions?
And don't hesitate to reach out to us. You'll have our contact info. LinkedIn works too, but we'd love to hear from you. And if there are projects you have coming up, or someone that you know who could use this, we would love an introduction or to continue the conversation with you.
Absolutely, Melanie.
It is a practice. That's why we gave guiding principles, because this is a practice. And you really have to, day by day, sort of consciously think about it. And you start to get into a groove of building new habits. Trish mentioned this many times. These words seem very normal, and it's in our vocabulary writ large. And it takes work to pause and to re-practice something new. You
A
have
little
to
bit of a
unlearn,
discipline. Yeah.
yeah, unlearn, then relearn, and try new practices. So, yeah, we're not going to get it right all the time. So, give grace and understanding for sure.
Me too, Danielle.
Oh, yeah, all the time, all the time. And don't be afraid to course correct yourself. With the team the other day, I was like, oh, I keep saying you guys. Just again, model the behavior of, oh, I caught myself. I shouldn't say you guys. Let me say y'all
Mhm.
or everyone.
Or make it a game. Try to replace, throughout the day. What can I replace? What words can I use differently?
Mhm. Catherine says, a recent specific example I noticed is a shift in the language around the term selective mutism. While selective mutism is still the official diagnosis, the term situational mutism feels much more accurate and is starting to be more commonly used. Selective can unintentionally imply choice. Yeah, when in reality, the inability to speak is driven by anxiety and depends on the situation,
Mhm.
not a person's willingness to communicate. That's such an important and powerful point, Catherine. Thank you for sharing that example.
Melanie says, another note on multilingual communication. Many languages are even more gender specific than English.
Correct. There are layers to the unlearning and relearning, and context that's asked it previously is all about that context matters, including what country are we in? What language is primary here?
Any other questions or thoughts? Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. We will be sending you the recording, like Amira mentioned, and any resources from today's session. So please look out for those in your inbox. And if you'd like to continue the conversation or connect with us, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us on all of our socials, as Amira said. Check us out on our website or feel free to send us an email directly. This is just the beginning of In Between Us, so we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.